In the summer of 1966, record temperatures were recorded with days upon days of 100 degrees or more. People, young and old, sought out refuge in typical places like pools, lakes, rivers, in an effort to cool down. Here in Little Rock, 3 African Americans visited Lake Nixon with the hopes of finding refuge from these extreme temperatures on Sunday, July 10th, 1966. When Doris Daniel, Rosalind Kiles, and their male friend attempted to gain entry to swim at both Lake Nixon and Spring Lake that day, they were told they were private clubs. The memberships were full, and no new members were being admitted. Well, these women felt discriminated against because of their race, and they brought suit against Lake Nixon, owned by Ewell Paul Jr., and Spring Lake, owned by J.A. Culberson. Both Daniel and Kiles were represented by attorney John W. Walker. The suit filed in U.S. District Court, Eastern District of Arkansas, Western Division in Little Rock, Arkansas, alleged that any white person would be admitted by paying an entry fee, but also stated that Negroes were being excluded in violation of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Ewell Paul Jr. feared that if they were to admit Negroes into Lake Nixon, they would lose most of their white customers. Paul claimed that Lake Nixon was made a private club in 1964 to include undesirables such as drunks and disorderly white patrons. Well, attorney John W. Walker claimed that the food concessions offered at both lakes were cause for violating the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through the interstate commerce aspect of the law. Walker highlighted that these so-called clubs were unable to operate without resources, both patrons and goods, from throughout and out of state. Walker appealed the original court's decision. Spring Lake withdrew itself from the case at this point. Evidence of Lake Nixon radio, magazine, and newspaper advertisements were presented and considered as well. The district court found that Lake Nixon had no proof that it operated as a club, instead finding that the club served interstate travelers and in and of itself satisfied the commerce requirement of the Civil Rights Act. Well, following the decision by the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals in St. Louis, the attorneys for both parties prepared arguments for consideration of the Supreme Court. And Paul feared that if the case proceeded to the U.S. Supreme Court, the decision would not come out in his favor. Well, around the same time, Dr. J.L. Cowling of Second Baptist Church had a vision for a day camp to be offered as a ministry at the church. People in the community were aware of the case against Lake Nixon. And Dr. Cowling arranged a deal with the Pauls for Second Baptist Church to purchase the property in late 1968. The first payment to the Pauls was not due until after the summer of 1969, which would be the first summer of day camp. The lawsuit was still pending in the U.S. Supreme Court system, and attorney Walker continued the appeal to the Supreme Court, even though the property was sold, since it might result in a precedent. The panel of judges heard the case of Daniel versus Paul, March 24th through 25th in 1969. Even though the Pauls no longer owned the property, civil rights lawyer for President Nixon's administration urged the court to settle the question of the admission of Negroes to privately operated organizations for recreation which are open to the white public. With a ruling of 7-1, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that privately owned recreation areas that offer swimming, picnicking, and similar facilities for white members cannot exclude Negroes. And according to survey historian Travis Raderman, who's with us today, Lake Nixon offers a remarkable contrast to the other civil rights or desegregation sites found in Little Rock or the rest of Arkansas due to its rural setting and the Central High integration case with regard to the amount of national attention paid to the outcome of the Supreme Court settled in 1969. If you Google Lake Nixon Club, you will be amazed by how many books, magazines, articles reference this very case. Raderman wrote and submitted the now approved nomination to the National Register of Historic Places with nationwide significance for Lake Nixon's significance in the areas of politics, government, and entertainment recreation. Travis goes on to describe Lake Nixon as a preserved example of a site associated with a national level desegregation case brought to the United States Supreme Court that inevitably set the precedent for entertainment and recreation establishments to not be able to discriminate based on race, and were found to be subject to Title II of the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
On behalf of the Arkansas Historic Preservation Program, I'd like to present a certificate recognizing Lake Nixon's historic role in desegregation to both Megan and the entire Second Baptist Church congregation on behalf